As I chatted to Emu, George looked down into the junk man's trolley, maybe in the hope that he might contain another tennis ball or something else of value that Emu might pass on to us, which, unfortunately, he rarely did, seeing as he rarely picked up anything of value. When Emu told people that he traded in disposable goods, he was being entirely accurate. While George searched the trolley and Emu ran his dirty handkerchief across his forehead once more, I turned around in response to the sharp footsteps I heard coming up to the hill towards us. It was a woman struggling slowly up the footpath. She was well dressed, as my mother would say, wearing a woolen suit and black high-heeled shoes. She was carrying a small case under her arm. She stopped when she got near the side door of the old ham and beef shop. We looked over at her. She opened the case and took out a slip of paper. She looked down at it, up at the number on the door, and then briefly over at us, before crumpling up the piece of paper into her hand. She knocked at the door. The woman must have been expected, because no sooner had she knocked than the door opened. The woman on the street seemed startled. She took a step back onto the footpath before stepping forward again and disappearing into the house. I watched Emu as he watched the door. Hey, Emu, why are there always so many women going into that place? That woman gets more visitors to her place than the corner shop. Is she selling something? If Emu had heard what I had asked him, he ignored me. He was now looking up at the rooftop, closely examining the lead flashing. I had to shout at him several times before he answered me, and he took his time in responding, scratching the end of his chin with his dirty nails and then knitting his brow. Well, Michael, the woman lives there is Wilma Carson. They call her Kid in the pub. The woman call her Kid. Well, she's like a doctor, yeah? She does work like a doctor for all the girls that come knocking at her door. And she's like the undertaker too. She's the doctor and undertaker all in one. They don't like to talk to her and they don't like visiting. But in the end, well, most of them, they knock at Kid's door. One day or another, they all knock on Kid's door. Emu told his story with only passing interest. His attention remained firmly on our roof, and then, as if suddenly reminded by a chore buried somewhere in the back of his mind, he picked up his cart and wheeled it onto the road. Have to be going now, to the Sly Grog, plenty of bottles for old Emu down there. And with that, Emu headed down the hill, barely able to maintain control of his cart. I watched him struggle on his way before turning to George. He mad, isn't he, Emu? Like a doctor? How could she be like a doctor, or an undertaker? He doesn't know what he's talking about. A doctor? Is he mad? George sat down and rested his back against the base of the streetlight. He's mad for sure, fucking old Emu. But he's right, though, about what she does in there. She treats the women who come knocking at the door. Treats them? With what? You're mad yourself, George. What do you mean? What does she treat them with? Who told you that? No one had to tell me, just heard it. When Mrs. Arnold, from the hardware, when her daughter, you know, the one with the big tits and pigtails that goes to the nuns' school on Nicholson Street, you know her. I knew the girl from the hardware store on Smith Street, with big tits and pigtails who went to convent school. But I had no idea what Wilma Carson would be treating it for. Well, Mrs. Arnold, she was up at our place one night picking up some finishing that Mum had done for her, some aprons, tea towels and stuff, and when she was about to leave, the two of them stood on the veranda talking. I was in the front room watching the telly and I heard them through the window. She wanted to know where she could get her daughter fixed up. That's what she called it, fixed up. And Mum told her to go and see Wilma Carson. That's what she does, Michael. When women don't want to have a baby, when they get pregnant and have to get rid of the kid, she does a treatment on them. That's what my mum called it, a treatment. I hesitated before asking George my next question. A treatment? What the fuck is that, George? What sort of treatment does she give him? Don't ask me, Michael. I'm not a fucking doctor. I laughed at him. Yeah, neither is she. What would she know about being a doctor or treating anybody? Don't believe it, George. You don't know what you're talking about. Well, I don't give a fuck, Michael. I'm just telling you what I heard. But I'll tell you something else. I saw Mrs. Arnold's girl coming out of that door. George pointed across the road in the direction of the ham and beef shop. The week after her mum spoke to mine, and she didn't look too good either. Her mum drove that old Morris of hers around the corner just to pick her up. Around the corner, Michael. She couldn't even walk the 200 yards home. We stayed out on the footpath talking while waiting for the woman to come out of the side door again. But we did not see her. She must have left by the back gate, walked along the laneway, and cut through to Smith Street. I puzzled over what it was that George had told me for a few days before I summoned enough courage to raise the issue with Mum. She was in her usual spot at the kitchen table, labelling and rearranging photographs in one of the many albums that she had filled over the years. I sat down next to her and watched her as she worked. My mother diligently recorded the date, the names of people, the location, and any special occasion that a photograph might relate to on the back of each image before placing it in the album. She looked over at me as I followed her work. I saw George today, Mum. She was holding a photo of a then newborn Katie in her hand. My father is also in the photograph. He is awkwardly holding Katie away from his body, looking like he's about to drop her. My mother did not look up at me. Well, that's not exactly news, is it, Michael? You see him every day, don't you? How is he? How's his mum? She asked while returning Katie to her place in the album. I shifted nervously from foot to foot. He's good, Mum. Real good. I don't know about his mum, though. He didn't mention her. Suppose she's okay. I hesitated for another moment and then let it out in one long, nervous rant. Mum, today when I was with George and old Emu, he was there too in the street with us. Well, George was telling me, well, they both were, that Wilma Carson, they're around the corner, that she does these sort of treatments, they call them. Well, she does them for women at her place there. She helps them, fixes them up, George said, if they get pregnant, George said. Emu said. My mother did not say anything. She did not so much as look at me. She continued to concentrate on recording the documentation on the back of one of her photographs. Show day, 1966. Then she rested the pen on the kitchen table. She did not appear at all angry, as I expected that she might be. She even smiled at me. Listen, love, I like George. He's a good kid. It's a wonder that he is talking to you at all, after what happened between you two in the yard out there. But between him and that gossiping old man Emu and all his bullshit, well, between the two of them, they wouldn't know what they're talking about. She picked another photograph from the pile on the table. It was one of herself. She is standing in the street with my grandmother. The photograph was taken in front of their old house in Carlton when my own mother was just a girl. It was the day of her Holy Communion. Just as my mother had done with the other images, she checked the back of the photograph to make sure that all of the information had been accurately documented. It was obvious that through her silence my mother was letting me know that our conversation about Wilma Carson was over, but I was not satisfied. It's not like that, Mum. George is right. He heard his mum talking with Mrs. Arnold from the hardware about her daughter. She got in trouble and had to go and see Wilma. And well, I've seen lots of women going in there. Me and George and Amy, we saw a woman knock there today. She fixes them up when they get pregnant. She fixes them up so they don't have to have a baby. My mother hit me so hard across the face that I fell from my chair. She jumped up from the table and pushed her chair towards the sink before turning on me. I lay on the cold liner of the kitchen floor holding my burning cheek. I thought that she was about to hit me again and covered my face with my hands, but she didn't. She crouched down over me and screamed at me while waving a finger in my face. Get to bed now. All you do is hang around on that street all day listening to shit talk. Is that all you do, Michael? Listen to old men talk bullshit? Get to bed now and stay away from Emu. Now go to bed. If my mother had hit me when I was a kid, I had no memory of it, and I could not remember seeing her as angry as she was now. I felt her hand shaking with rage against my shoulder as she dragged me to my feet and pushed me out of the kitchen towards the bedroom. I walked into the bedroom and slammed the door behind me. I jumped into bed without taking my clothes off and buried myself under the blanket. I could not understand why she had hit me. I knew that what George had said to me was right. As soon as she had told me about Mrs. Arnold's conversation with his mother, all the mystery around Wilma Carson made sense. The women knocking at her door and the women who tried ignoring her in the street. It all made sense after what George had told me. I heard Mum's footsteps in the hallway. They stopped outside the bedroom door. She paused for a moment before opening it. I did not open my eyes or move, hoping to convince her that I was asleep. I could hear her breathing heavily as she stood over me. She shook me by the shoulder. Get up, Michael. She had my dressing gown draped over one arm. Come on, out in the kitchen. I've already put the kettle on. I was not sure what time it was, but I knew that it was late. I followed her into the kitchen, expecting that she was about to start yelling at me again. The kitchen was freezing. She motioned for me to come to the table as I wrapped my dressing gown around me. Sit down. I'll make tea. The photo albums that she had been working on were still sitting on the table. She made a pot of tea, grabbed 2 cups from the sideboard and brought everything over to the table on a tray, as if this was going to be a formal occasion. We sat at the table together watching the steaming draw of the tea. She then leaned across the table and took both my hands in hers. Emu's got some stories, hasn't he? Sometimes he's right and, well, sometimes he's just a silly old bastard, isn't he? She squeezed my hands between hers until it hurt. We've all got them, our stories, haven't we? But they don't all have to be told, do they, Michael? Mrs. Arnold from the hardware, she's a good woman, Michael. She has to run that shop on her own while trying to bring up her kids the right way. She does the best she can, and just because her daughter got into trouble, it doesn't mean that you or George or silly old Emu have the right to talk about that family all over the street. She waved a finger back and forth in front of my face. And any of those other women knocking at Wilma's door, they're entitled to their privacy too. You have no idea who has had to knock on that door, Michael. It could be anyone from around here, any of us. And you're too young to know why they end up there. She released my hand and stood up from the table. I'm sorry for hitting you. I really am. She motioned in the direction of the front room, her and Dad's room, with a nod of her head. You get enough of that from him as it is. Whatever it is you want to know, I don't care what it is. I want you to come to me instead of listening to some imbecile in the street. I've got my own story, Michael, and I want you to listen to it. And then I don't want you ever talking about Wilma Carson or the other women who knock on her door again." My mother ran her hands nervously through her hair before sitting down at the table once more. "When I was just a girl, living in Canning Street House in Carlton, when I was about 10 or 11, there was this woman, Agnes Meager. She was like Wilma Carson. She did abortions for women who got pregnant and couldn't have the baby. You know what I mean, Michael? An abortion? Do you know what I'm talking about?" I nodded my head, although I wasn't entirely sure what she was talking about. Agnes lived just up the street from us. If anyone on the street was sick, she would look after them, mostly powders and ointments for aches and pains. No one could afford a doctor in those days, not without getting grilled by some noisy social worker. Agnes laid out the dead too, right there in the house, so that the family could view anyone who died, prayed with them before they were buried. It was better that way. Keep them in the house with the family until the funeral. She laid out my own dad. Got crushed in an accident at work, shunting a train. Mum had his body released from the morgue, and Agnes, well, she patched him up, so we could have a mass with him at home. At the mention of her own father, my mother became briefly distracted. She flipped through the pages of one of the albums until she found a photograph of him. She spun the album around on the table and pointed to an image of him in a military uniform. "There he is." She tapped on the image several times before going on with the story. "She wasn't a bad woman, Agnes. Some kept a little distance from her, just like we do with Wilma, but they needed her, just like we need Wilma now, all of us." My mother stopped again. She looked over at me and then away to the window. She looked back at me with fear on her face. "Well, one day, when I was in the kitchen, me and Mum, your grandmother, well, Agnes, she come banging and screaming at the back gate, calling out for Mum to help her. As soon as Mum opened the gate, Agnes ran past her into the laundry and threw something. It was wrapped in newspaper into the trough. Agnes told Mum that the police were on their way and that she would give Mum 10 shillings to get rid of that parcel for her. And then Agnes warned her, 'Don't open it and don't put it in the bin, just flush it down the toilet.' And with that, she left. While Mum was looking down into the trough, I walked up behind her and looked over her shoulder down at the parcel. I could see blood seeping through the newspaper. I could not take my eyes away from it. Mum moved to pick up the newspaper and then pulled her hand back and told me to get out of the room. I wouldn't move at first, but she screamed and yelled at me until I left. I knew there was something wrong and I was scared. So I went up into my room and hid behind the door. I could hear her. She repeatedly flushed the toilet out the back. I did not dare to come back down into the kitchen until it was near tea time. The whole house, the kitchen, the laundry and toilet, everything, it all smelled of bleach and disinfectant. Mum couldn't get the house clean enough. My mother put the teapot and empty cups back onto the tray and walked over to the sink and turned on the tap and started washing her hands. There's nothing wrong with Wilma Carson or the women who go to her. They've got to go somewhere. And she knows what she's doing better than most. We would be in a lot of more trouble if we didn't have her help, Michael. We wouldn't need her if it wasn't for the men. Don't forget that, Michael, ever. You won't hear that from old Emu or any of the others around here." She turned around from the sink to face me. "I don't want us to talk about this again. Most can't mind their business on the street, but I want you to. Leave the gossip to Emu, because the day will come when his mouth will get him in a lot of trouble, and that will be the end of old Emu. No one will see him again." She wiped down the kitchen table, touched my shoulder with her hand, and left me sitting there on my own. I searched through the albums, looking at the baby photographs of Katie and me. It was in one of the earliest albums that I found the blank spaces. I ran a finger around the border where a photograph had been removed.